From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. We are pleased today to have a fifth-generation San Franciscan on our show. And as a born and raised San Franciscan myself, I welcome the opportunity to say hello to a young lady who went to Madison, then Berks, then Lowell. She's smart. You know right away when a kid goes to Lowell, they're smart. And then UC Berkeley, later to get a master's degree at St. Mary's. Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon and Ivers HItz. And that sounds like I'm saying something, Ivers HItz. As a guy who coached Little League, won the Mill Valley City Championship even, I want to know, is it true that Ivers HItz?
Well, we had high hopes for our son, but he didn't take to baseball.
You have written 3 books. You've written a book on the Emporium, and one of your ancestors was a managing partner at the Emporium. And you've written a book on the lost department stores of San Francisco. I know all about the city of Paris and the White House and many of the lost department stores. And as a native San Franciscan, remember going downtown San Francisco, the ladies always wore gloves and hats and so on. I loved the old department stores and missed them, as a matter of fact. But you made a craft of writing these books and one on our beloved Ferry Building, kind of a jewel on the San Francisco Embarcadero. So tell me a little bit about, your beginnings in San Francisco. You were born in St. Luke's, and what are your early memories as a young child growing up in our beautiful city?
Well, going downtown with my grandmother, and you always got dressed up. That was required. It was quite a different scene then. And I hope someday it comes back post-pandemic, and if we can solve some of our homeless problems. But no, I love growing up in the city. I was in the Presidio all the time, exploring, and Golden Gate Park, and it was just a wonderful place to grow up.
Did you ride your bike?
Yep, rode my bike, walked my dog. My mother used to just say, everybody out of the house, go, go.
I used to go from like Hyde and Green. We would go all the way down Larkin Street till we would get to Market Street. We'd turn left. We'd go by the Crystal Palace, which was on the south side of Market Street,
Right.
and ride our bicycles all the way down to the Embarcadero. And then we would turn left and go all the way to Broadway, and then turn left on Broadway and go all the way up Broadway to where the tunnel was around Stockton. And then we'd cut over and then go up over to the top of the hill where we started. And that was called, when you were a 6th and 7th grader, that was called Around the World. That was around the world.
Very cool. I used to go through the Presidio and all the way out to Ocean Beach and then come back. That was kind of my regular route.
In 7th grade, I went to Marina Junior High School. So we would ride our bikes down to Marina and back. Every now and then, I didn't ride the buses much, but you could ride the buses. I think they were like a nickel or something like that. And it always seemed like a kind of a waste of time because they were slower than bikes.
Right.
Okay, so you're prompted to write this beautiful book on the Ferry Building. And the Ferry Building, of course, has gone through this incredible restoration about 25 years or so ago, and is now a beautiful market. Tell us the story, what prompted you to write this book, and tell us about the Ferry Building.
Thank you, Ron. I wrote my first book in 2014, the Emporium book, and I was kind of looking around thinking about another idea. And I got involved with City Guides, which is a program of the San Francisco Public Library. It's volunteers who give tours of San Francisco. And I was training to become a ferry building guide. And I thought, I wonder if there's a book on it published by Arcadia, who does these sort of hyper-local history books. And so I sent a note to my editor and I said, are you interested? And she said, yes. So it was, it was pretty easy. And although I don't commit to doing a book unless I know I can find enough material, because otherwise I'm obviously going to get a little hung up on it. And the publisher required about 200 photos, but I found lots and lots of good photos. And the buildings had such an interesting history. Speaking of losing its sense of purpose after the bridges were built, I mean, it was very close to being torn down.
So right off the bat, I have to say that whale boat in the foreground just past the boy and the kids looking at the ferry building from a ferry, I'm assuming. Whaleboats were used by the U.S. Navy to teach naval seamen how to sail and how to basically get friendly with the water. You know, when you're on a 600-foot destroyer, you need some interface like a whaleboat to learn about the water. And I learned to sail in one of those as a Sea Scout. Those were selling for the right price of $1 in the Mare Island Naval Shipyard when I was a young kid. And the Sea Scouts would go over there and buy them, and then we'd fix them up and varnish them and paint them up like they were new. But those very whaleboats are taught a lot of people about seamanship, let me tell you. They became, lifeboats, of course. That's what they were. Whaleboats were lifeboats. And you could even sail them. They had a lateen sail you could rig up on them. You were really lost at sea.
Well, I did not know that about that boat. Thank you for giving me that little bit of background. I just like this picture because the kids seem excited. They're on their way to the Ferry Building. Although, as you mentioned earlier, it's hard not to focus on the little person's backside there.
It's also hard for people to remember. That says SP, meaning the Southern Pacific Railroad,
right,
which was at the base of Market Street.
Right.
And people don't really appreciate what a big deal the SP was in those days. The train tracks, as I know we're going to see, came right down to the Embarcadero. There were short line spurs there, and there was a huge switching yard over where the 3rd Street sort of terminal is now. And it was a big thing. It was as big in the world of people in San Francisco as Apple is right now, or Microsoft.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, Southern Pacific, they owned a lot of the ferry lines. The whole point was, once the Transcontinental Railroad, I'll get more into this, once the Transcontinental Railroad was built, Southern Pacific would bring people to Oakland, and their ticket included a ferry ticket to San Francisco. That was just part of the deal. So they owned a lot of the lines. I mean, it was a very competitive business, but they definitely owned a lot of the lines. So let me get going here on what San Francisco looked like before bridges. Here's an early picture of the harbor around 1881. And really the only way into the city was by boat, unless you were coming from the south on the peninsula area. But the bay did not have any bridges. And after the gold rush, it was a pretty chaotic port because of our lack of infrastructure. But let's go.
Before you switch off this map, what's the year of this?
1881.
1881.
Yeah. Do you reckon that
Yeah.
you're a boat person? Yeah.
Yeah. On the left side of the picture, that bay that you're looking at right there, that was called Mission Bay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's now all filled in now. And that long pier there, that was called a Long Bridge. And jutting eastward on it was a Hobbs Wharf. And the intersection of Long Bridge and Hobbs Wharf is right where the oldest yacht club in the Pacific was founded. San Francisco Yacht Club, the parent of St. Francis Yacht Club, was founded there in 1869. This is a great shot here. That bay gets all filled in, of course, becomes all land. First as water lots, and then as actual lots. And all the dirt from Rincon Hill here got shoved into that bay and filled up. It's partially filled when this drawing is made.
I'd heard of Long Wharf and all that, but I did not know all those facts and how they all sort of...
Long Bridge was the SP's shortcut going north to San Francisco, tying into what you're talking about, as opposed to going around the bay. Mission Bay went up toward Mission Creek, which went to Mission Dolores, the original settlement in San Francisco. That's what that narrowing to the right of that bay is. Okay,
well, here's another fun older shot. In 1875, the Port Commission saw that revenues were increasing from East Bay ferry traffic, so they wanted an elegant ferry house, and this is what was first built. And you can see all the carts and wagons and horses and sailors and merchants crowding around down there. It was built for $93,000.
What year was this year?
1875.
Wonderful.
And
so people can see the trolley cars before there's engines in them. They're being towed.
It was located at Clay and Market, north of where the current Ferry Building is. But it became San Francisco's population was just exploding, and this had 4 slips. It became too small within 10 years of its construction, even with additional slips that were added by 1889. I love this picture from the Historical Society. So this is at the old ferry house, and commuters signs overhead showing where they could catch, they catch the ferry to the East Bay and then take a train. And so you see Sacramento, Los Angeles, or maybe San Antonio.
San Jose, too. San
Yeah.
Jose.
Yep, San Jose. This is Market Street. It just gives you an idea how chaotic it was. This is 1892. Well, Market Street's still challenging in my mind, especially now that they don't want cars, and it's a tough one to drive, but I think it was even more chaotic then.
People in San Francisco forget that Market Street was the market street.
Yeah.
It's where you brought your produce and you sold stuff, you traded stuff. That's what it was. It was
Right.
a big, gigantic bazaar on both sides of the street. People set up and sold stuff, and then stores for them.
Well, and I'll get into the Ferry Building itself in a sec, but it is directly at the end of Market Street. It was built to be a beacon at the end of Market. I love this picture. I found this on eBay, and it's an 1897 picture of ferry passengers on Oakland to San Francisco. And I love the hats, and I just can't imagine the hat pins that must be anchoring these things, especially the woman in the middle who has these wings kind of going off her hat. But no woman of stature would venture out without her hat. So they kept them anchored.
Wonderful.
Here's a 1902 photo. A bond measure was passed in 1892 for $600,000 to build a new ferry building. And as we all know, in San Francisco, $600,000 these days won't even get you a studio apartment, unfortunately. And it did turn out to be not enough for the original plans. An aspiring young architect was hired named A. Page Brown. And he traveled to Europe and looked at transit stations in some of the great cities, such as London and Milan. But his original design was even wider than what we have now. The cost of concrete came in too high, so he had to cut it back. So our current ferry building opened to great fanfare on July 13th, 1898. And everyone, it got great reviews. The Chronicle said, the design of this building is one combining simplicity with quiet elegance, yet the ensemble is impressive. Too much praise cannot be accorded to the architect A. Page Brown for the originality, the cleverness, and the skill he has shown in his work. And he had a challenging time doing it. I mean, it was a limited budget in earthquake country on mud, basically. Because, as you are probably aware, Ron, the water really kind of came up to Montgomery Street. It was quite an engineering marvel. Unfortunately, Brown did not live to see it finished. He was in a buggy accident and he was killed. And his colleague, Mr. Swain, Edward Swain, was the architect who saw it through to completion. So he's noted on the plaque on the front. So I love this picture. To me, it really illustrates what a central place this building was for commuters. This is a moment in time captured in March of 1915. So around the time of the Pan-Pacific International Exposition, which I'll talk about later. But throngs of commuters are rushing to catch their ferries home, and they cross the State Belt Railroad tracks there, which ran in front of the ferry building. And around this time, about 60,000 commuters passed through the ferry building in the morning, and again in the evening, riding 23 different ferry boats that made a total of 180 trips a day. The ferry system was integral to San Francisco's transportation network. You could get from your home in the East Bay, you could get on a streetcar, come down, catch a ferry, get across the bay, take another streetcar to your office. It was a pretty gracious way to travel. And at its height, it was second only to Charing Cross in London as far as pedestrian and commuter traffic. So here's a dapper looking fellow in his top hat. He was a news vendor selling his papers. This is around 1900.
So this is a day when you could make money in the newspaper business.
Yeah, nobody's got their phone in their hand looking at their apps, right? So back to our talk about Market Street. It really was the center of things. I include this illustration because it just shows you the Ferry Building standing there at the end. That was definitely the architect's intention. The tower itself is on a slightly different angle on its foundation than the rest of the building, just so it could be seen at the end of Market Street. So this is 1899 with a parade welcoming soldiers home from the Philippines. This is the fighting first, and they fought in the Philippine-American War. They were met with a hero's welcome, including a banquet in the nave of the Ferry Building. We'll talk more about the nave in a bit. And here is a picture of the ground floor. People used to come in on the second floor to catch their ferries, go down a ramp, and the lower floor was kept for luggage storage and ticket offices. So we'll talk more about the nave in a bit, but this just gives you a picture of the old building. A. Page Brown really envisioned the nave as a great gathering place. So this talks about President McKinley coming, and there was a reception for him in the nave. And he had a cold at the time and didn't want to shake hands. So the story goes, he stood up on a little dais, and San Franciscans walked past him waving little American flags to greet him. And I find that so simple and wonderful compared to the security that our current presidents have to have. You're not gonna find us welcoming somebody in such a casual way.
So this newspaper, The Call, later it forms with the Bulletin to become the Call Bulletin.
Right.
Exactly, which I sold as a young newspaper boy when I was a 6th and 7th grader in San Francisco.
Really?
Yes, I made subscriptions. I was delivered it, and it was a whole fun episode of my life.
Great. Right. Well, this was 1901, so well before your time. And the Grand Nave was 660 feet long, or it still is, and 48 feet wide, with 42-foot high ceilings, and it's a very elegant spot for gatherings. Another gathering that was in the nave, which I find very amusing. I found these photos up at the State Library in Sacramento, and they'd never been digitized. But in 1902, there was a citrus fair in the nave, sponsored by the State Board of Trade, and 15,000 people a day attended the 10-day fair. And it was the largest citrus fair held in the state. And the point of the fair was a competition between Northern California and Southern California about their citrus. And Northern California wanted to prove that it had a very robust citrus industry. And different counties had exhibits, but Shasta County decided to not go the produce route. And they say the value of the output of the copper mines of Shasta County is greater than the value of the combined product of all the prune orchards of California. So they wanted to promote their mining, and they say it's better than any prunes any of you other counties can produce. I just thought this was very fun.
In the advertising world, that last poster would not have won any headline contest.
No, it would not. It was too wordy, too wordy. So this earnest looking bunch of young fellows is the Stockton Boys Band, who played at the Citrus Festival. And it was 30 boys, and many people, actually about 300 people came from Stockton to hear their hometown boys play at this festival. So this just gives you an idea of the kinds of community gatherings that were held at the Ferry Building. So let's fast forward. The Ferry Building opened in 1898 and had a few good years, and then the earthquake hit. And we all know it was not just the shaking, but the 3 days of fire that really destroyed a good part of San Francisco.
1906, for the people who don't know that the big earthquake was in 06.
April 18th. So the Ferry Building actually was not damaged much. Some tiles fell off the tower, but it had a steel infrastructure, and it made a really big difference. Now, General Funston, who was in charge of the relief effort, knew that he had to keep the ferry building from burning because all the evacuations, everything went through the ferry building, getting supplies in and getting evacuees out. So he had fireboats out in the bay, just keeping it, standing by to keep it from burning, because it was a lot of downtown burned, really. A lot of the financial district, Union Square, all those areas burned. Now, they were a little worried about the tower's stability, so they found 5,000 feet of cable car cable, like what pulls the cable cars up the hills. And they wrapped the ferry building tower in that cable, just in case some aftershocks produced nasty surprises.
Wow. 5,000 feet is almost a mile of cable.
Yeah, I know. And it's I love the low-tech aspect, I guess. We got the cable, let's just wrap it and hope for the best. So this woman with all her worldly goods is waiting to get out of town. And I think her expression and the weariness really comes through here. And the importance of the ferry building. She's right there in one of the arches. So this is now Southern Pacific. They evacuated hundreds of thousands of people on its ferries and trains for free. They did step up. They weren't known as a particularly generous company overall, but they just starting 45 minutes after the disaster and lasting for the next 5 days, Southern Pacific ran 1,400 trains throughout the Bay Area to move people out. So the work of rebuilding began. Many of the streetcar tracks were twisted. So here's a shot from 1907 where they were doing repairs because getting the city's infrastructure back was of paramount importance.
It was a huge building boom too for the construction industry in San Francisco. Colossal building boom.
So this is what we would call, Ron, you worked in PR, right? This was a PR shot. Yeah, that is right. This is a stage shot just 2 weeks after the earthquake. And the fellow at the front of the car is Patrick Calhoun, who was head of United Railroads, and Mayor Schmitz was also on board. And they wanted to show the first regular streetcar departing from the ferry building. And they kind of gerrymandered up, the way it would work. It was powered by electricity from temporary wires that had been strung overhead. And electricity was not really used before then for this, but they did this to get the streetcar going. So here we are back and shiny in 1908, celebrating the arrival in San Francisco of the Great White Fleet, Roosevelt's ships that sailed around the world, 16 American warships, support vessels, and 14,000 men. So the city was all spiffed up to greet them. They were painted white and gold. I mean, maybe you have some images of this at the yacht club. And the ships cruised worldwide, 43,000 miles, 20 ports of calls on 6 continents. And Teddy Roosevelt's aim was not only to promote goodwill, but also to show the world that the U.S. had become a major sea power.
And you're right, we actually did have a couple of talks on the Great White Fleet's tour and stop in San Francisco, maybe about 5 years ago as part of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Back in the days before we were Zooming and we were in-person meetings. Right?
Well, those days will come again, we hope. Yep. So another fair, which I'm sure you're familiar with, the Pan-Pacific International Exposition in 1915, which was ostensibly to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal, but it was really our way of showing that San Francisco was back in business after the earthquake. So
we beat St. Louis, we beat several other cities.
Yeah.
The whole this fair.
Yeah. Right. So one of the featured floats was a 60-foot scale model of the ferry building, all lit up with electric lights. And this Henry C. Peterson, I think, was the sponsor.
How could I tell?
Yeah. Not exactly tiny type, huh? And crowds applauded as it approached. And it was towed by a barge to the PPIE on October 23rd, 1915, which was Harbor Day, and again on November 2nd, which was San Francisco Day. So I thought this was a fun photo.
Wonderful.
So another fun thing, this was a postcard I found on eBay. Meet me at the ferry in San Francisco. I won't give you the slip. A little play on words there, but it really was. Riding the ferries. It was not only an efficient way to commute, but it was a social thing too. People had their regulars on there, and heaven forbid you should sit in somebody else's seat. I mean, they had card games, they had birthday parties, they you name it. It was a party on these things. And it sounds like kind of a fun way to commute. Well, on a different note, this probably looks familiar. This is the 1918 flu epidemic, when we wore masks, or you were supposed to. But the word, you were supposed to wear it on the ferry too. But ferry riders, the men, wanted to smoke their pipes, and so they could get arrested when they landed if they didn't follow the mask rules. So this picture shows somebody being hauled off. This is around 1918, 1919. Around, San Francisco was hit by the flu epidemic. The final tally was about 3,500 fatalities. So the building, it was such a central part of the city. Here we have some, this is 1918, troops arriving from training camp through the Ferry Building, and a crowd lines the street and the rooftops to greet them. So you find pictures saying, "Welcome home, boys," and parades and banquets. And it was just where San Francisco gathered to greet people. Here we go. Boys, San Francisco is proud of you. So here we have the nave again with the potted palms and flags, and good luck, God bless you.
Somebody wrote, and then somebody painted that sign. In those days, signs like that were hand painted.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I remember exactly. People would paint signs. Of course, I wasn't around in those days, but people were still hand painting signs.
Sure. No digital printing, no print on demand.
Right, exactly.
So this was when San Francisco, this picture is from April 1919, when members of the 363rd and 347th Divisions, San Francisco's own, came home from World War I. So the day was declared a holiday, and the city turned out to welcome them. And they had such massive crowds lining Market Street that the troops had to stop the parade. I guess they were afraid of a enthusiastic stampede. So here's another enthusiastic group. This is in 1939, the World's Fair held out on Treasure Island. Now this was the height of the Depression, but crowds headed to load onto one of the Key System or Southern Pacific ferries to go out to Treasure Island, which the ferry companies scheduled extra runs for the duration of the fair. It was San Francisco's last World Fair and the last large-scale public celebration before we entered World War II. So life on the ferries, as I said, it was really a kind of a genteel way to travel. Here's the Cazadero, which traveled to Sausalito from San Francisco in just 30 minutes. You could sip your orangeade at a ferry concession. You could get your shoes shined. You could buy a paper. You could buy candy, cigars, popcorn. You could get souvenirs, guide maps for the city, and you could also eat a meal. As it took 30 minutes or less to cross the bay, the cafes were often crowded. Our own Herb Cain, who I'm sure all you are familiar with, he especially loved the incomparable corned beef hash on the Oakland Ferry on the way back after a night with Benny Goodman at McFadden's Ballroom. And a 1938 menu from the Eureka featured roast beef jardiniere for 40 cents, boiled brisket of beef with Spanish sauce for 45 cents, and homemade corned beef hash for 30 cents. So I know that sounds very inexpensive to us now. I don't know, compared to salaries, it was probably, hefty. So once cars came on the scene and everybody wanted one, the ferries had to adjust. I mean, Southern Pacific was reluctant because they didn't want to cut down on train traffic, but it meant that they had to accommodate motorists. So different ferry companies soon had auto ferries available. And you could easily take a ferry to Marin or the East Bay and go for a Sunday drive. Motorists would line up on the Embarcadero to wait their turn to get on. And even though the ferries were supposed to keep to a schedule, they often left when the deckhands had gotten as many cars on board as possible. They just took off. So here you have some cars lined up along the Embarcadero. By 1927, more people owned cars, and of the 10 ferry slips, Southern Pacific used slips 9 and 10 at the southern end of the building for its automobile ferries to the East Bay. Ferries to Marin and Vallejo, the longest ride at 30 minutes, left from the north end of the building or from the Hyde Street Pier. In 1938, the year this photo was taken, ferry service to Sausalito ended as the Golden Gate Bridge had opened in 1937. The Bay Bridge opened in 1936. And ridership declined dramatically, just dramatically. It dropped off. Everybody wanted to drive a car. It's interesting to note that in 1930, just 8 years earlier, 43 ferry boats had carried 47 million passengers around the bay. So it looks like the regulars wanted to end on a high note. I see streamers here and lots of celebration.
What's the occasion of this 1938 photograph?
It's the last run of this ferry. Yeah, the last run of this ferry. Let's take a look at the Embarcadero. There was a passenger bridge going over the Embarcadero to take passengers into the second floor. And you can see why it was necessary. It was pretty heavily used by a number of different transportation modes. You have streetcars here, you have taxis, and you have the State Belt Railroad, which served the different ports to haul freight, and it's spewing out quite a bit of black smoke there. So, you wouldn't want a lot of pedestrians crossing here at the same time. So the State Belt line began in the 1880s, and its tracks extended all along the Embarcadero from South and Market to Fort Mason and the Presidio. I'm not sure when it ended.
In the 80s and 90s, it still existed there. I used it in the 70s. I put a boxcar display for what was then ITEL Rail.
Oh,
For an annual sales meeting. So you actually still had a short line spur down there in the late 70s.
I did not know that.
Right down by Embarcadero Center. Yeah.
So here's pictures, a picture with the pedestrian bridge above, and here are commuters getting on their streetcars to take them throughout the city. As the city grew westward and the tunnel was built out there near Laguna Honda, that prompted more development out there, and transportation was really key. So this is how people got around.
So your pictures all have so many fun features. The poster on the front.
Yes,
Isn't that wonderful?
Robert
Louis
Stevenson.
Robert Louis Stevenson's Kidnapped.
Yeah.
So fun. 2 hits by Fox, The Little Rascals, and that's really cool to see that early entertainment featured on the front of the trolley cars.
Well, and I have to say, doing the photo research for this, it's kind of like I never wanted to make up my mind about anything because I was having so much fun finding things. But, eventually I had to nail down exactly what I was going to use and get permission. So
many of our viewers are also noticing that every man has a hat on and women have hats on. And you remember which politician stopped hats in America. He just stopped them in their tracks, especially at his inaugural address when he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country."
JFK
didn't wear hats, did not like to wear hats.
I did not know that he kind of
his popularity drove a spike in the popularity of hats. Hats stopped at that point.
Wow, because everybody wore hats then. Before
exactly.
that. Yeah.
Right up until then, correct.
Yeah. So here's a dramatic picture of the Golden Gate Bridge, just to show you, it was quite an engineering marvel, as we know. So this is during construction in 1935, a view of the south San Francisco tower of the Golden Gate Bridge after the north Marin County side tower had been built. So here's in 1940, another publicity shot, basically. Somebody's saying, oh no, my ferry isn't working today. So after the two bridges opened, Southern Pacific reduced its service to 3 routes. And by 1940, autos and interurban trains traveled on the bridge, but passenger ferries continued until 1958 in a greatly reduced way. So what to do with our poor little ferry building? The waterfront was really in decline, and there were various ideas, some of them kind of out there, to save it. There were grand schemes to save the declining waterfront. This is a proposal for a San Francisco World Trade Center, and it was envisioned to provide 3 million square feet of floor space centered on a 30-story tower for agencies, services, individuals, and companies dealing with world commerce. Quite a grand scheme. And it would be located on Bay Fill, due east of the current Ferry Building, which is not a great idea in an area prone to earthquakes. Instead, we got a freeway, but I'll talk about that in a sec. Here's another proposal that was floated. We had you can see our little Ferry Building tower in the middle there. That would be all that was left. And then 2 towers on the other side. This is from the San Francisco Planning Commission's downtown plan in 1963. And it would
5-3?
1963.
Okay, 63.
Sorry. The proposal included removing the wings of the Ferry Building, just leaving the tower to be at the center of a ferry park. A passenger ship terminal would be to the south, and an international trade center and heliport on the north side. Obviously, this did not get built either, but was quite a grand plan.
See how low the skyline is all around it in that?
Oh my gosh, I know. Can you imagine this getting through the Planning Commission nowadays?
And also, as everybody knows, the skyline is really tall in that view from this angle nowadays. Back in those days, it wasn't, correct?
Well, the Salesforce Tower would probably be towering over these guys. Who knows? Who knows? I mean, you can see that from everywhere. Okay, so Ron and I were talking a little bit about Cyril Magnin and the World Trade Club yesterday. But in 1957, Cyril, who was one of the city's leaders and a member of a very prominent mercantile family, he and George Killian, who was chief executive of the American President Lines, founded the World Trade Club, which was located in the Ferry Building. This matchbook was one of its giveaways. The club described itself as San Francisco's premier international business association. They were really trying to find, purposes for the building. Without the ferry traffic, it was a bit of a white elephant. So, as I said, the World Trade Club was there for a number of years, but it closed in 2006.
So, and I should say, at that time when it closed, before it closed, St. Francis members may remember, we did a kind of interesting deal with World Trade members. We brought about 60 of them in. I was vice chairman of the membership committee of St. Francis at the time. And we brought about 60 World Trade members in to St. Francis Yacht Club in a group to give them a kind of new home with the World Trade Club closing. And that was real fun, gentlemanly, I should say, a gracious gesture by our club to another club. And I'd gone there with Cyril back in the 80s, Cyril Magnin. And so we just thought it'd be a cool thing to do. And I initiated it, and the board approved it. And we brought those members into St. Francis Yacht Club.
Very cool. Furthering the building's demise, or not demise, downward trend, shall we say. The post-World War II infrastructure boom outlined a series of freeways in San Francisco. And the first one to get built in 1959 was the Embarcadero Freeway.
Right.
The other plans pretty much got trashed because of something called the Freeway Revolt. They got about 50,000 signatures to stop the building of the freeways because people, I don't think, had really realized what the building of these freeways would entail. But it was too late for the Embarcadero Freeway, which basically cut the Ferry Building off from the rest of downtown and really contributed to the port's downward trend. Jasper Rubin, who wrote a book on the port, said instead of helping port businesses, the freeway severed downtown from the waterfront, emphasizing the city's shift away from its historical maritime origins as it moved into its service sector future.
In the early beginning, late 60s, early 70s, there was an initiative to continue the Embarcadero Freeway north along the waterfront. And it was stopped by my then business partner, Alvin Duskin. Alvin Duskin threw his body across the railroad tracks, as it were, and said, no, no, no. He was also against the Trans-American Pyramid. I didn't agree with him on that. But he stopped the Embarcadero Freeway, became a supervisor in San Francisco over the matter, and stopped the Embarcadero Freeway. And then, of course, after Loma Prieta, Willie Brown and the boys took it down, to our great pleasure.
Right.
And we then reconnected with our waterfront and the beautiful Embarcadero Promenade, which is such a contributor to the waterfront in San Francisco.
Yeah. No, they as you said, the Loma Prieta earthquake, again, Mother Nature did her thing, 1989. And the freeway was damaged, but it was not a quick decision about what to do. Many, many meetings. I can't even imagine, do we repair it? Do we tear it down? How are we going to handle traffic? What's going to happen with the port? But they came up with a big master plan for the whole Embarcadero and decided to take it down. And thank you is what I say, because I think it's added so much to the city. But that being said, what to do with the building, how to find a purpose for it. So the freeway came down around 1992, and a plan was hatched to rehabilitate the Ferry Building so it would become a locally sourced food emporium. So here's an interesting picture of the work that was done on the building. I mean, it was a 100-year-old building, so it needed a lot of upgrades, but it also had so many historic designations that it's not something you can just have free reign doing. There were a lot of permits and things. They had to go to Washington actually to obtain permission to open the nave floor. You can see those cuts, because they wanted to bring light down to the main walkway on the lower floor. And without those cuts to bring light in from the skylights, it wasn't going to work. So that was the biggest change. But everything else was according to National Register protocol and everything that one has to do to follow the rules. So Jay Turnbull, who was the founding principal of the firm that managed the renovations, he went to Washington, as I said, and the National Park Service came here. He said, we modeled it, just tried to show them that the character really wouldn't be degraded by opening these elements up. In fact, it would share the experience with a lot of other people. So it gave people an eye into the nave. And here are some workers working on the windows. It was a huge project. I think it was a $110 million project.
Fantastic job they did.
So here we have the beautiful building all spiffed up. It emerged after a 4-year, $100 million meticulous restoration in 2003. And it, pre-pandemic, it was where both locals and tourists went for the Saturday farmers market, the restaurants. It's not a place where you're going to go do your grocery shopping. It's a little more high end than that, but it's been very, very successful. And I'm sure, things go in cycles. It will come back. It's a little little slow right now, but actually there are additional permits that have been filed for more ferry lines. So ferry ridership has really grown. It's recognized as a nice green way to travel, and it's pretty relaxing. Now, you'd think that would be the end of my presentation, but I have a little bit more because I was honored in 2017. This is not in the book because the book was published prior to that. I was asked to come into the Ferry Building tower in the middle of the night to watch the two vintage clock, it's our vintage clock dinging right now, to watch the two vintage clock buffs change the time in the spring. So it's changing to daylight savings time. And they said, you got to be there at 1:15 a.m. And I said, I'll do it. My husband thought I was crazy, but we just rented a room on the Embarcadero and made a fun thing of it. So I showed up, and it was like going back in time. It really was. You go up these very steep stairs. You feel like it's 1898. Nothing except a few earthquake reinforcements. That's Dorian Clare there. He's the clock keeper. He actually has a shop, an antique clock shop on Sanchez Street. So I met Dorian and his partner, and up we went. There's graffiti everywhere. It says things like Joe Schmo, Steeplejack, 1922. It was fascinating. So you get up to the 5th level, and there's Dorian going in this little hut, which houses the antique clock. It is the real thing. It just, he installed a motor, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And so it's not wind up anymore, but it is one of the largest mechanical clocks in the world. So here's Dorian looking at this beautiful machinery. It's the real thing. I mean, it's you'd think these days you could take an app and, you know, the time would change automatically, but Dorian was up there with this huge crowbar, and he pulls down like this, and all 4 clock faces go forward an hour.
For our younger viewers, before there were little silicone wafers transmitting pluses and minuses to tell us what time it was and to compute the time, we had all these mechanical gear systems. It was amazing.
Yeah, so the clock hands are 11 feet long. The clock faces are 22 feet in diameter, and each numeral is 3 feet high. So here I am. I took this picture from behind the clock, so you can see the numerals there, the back side of them. So that ends my presentation. And here we have a streetcar that says Ferries, Cliff, via California. You could get all the way out to the Cliff House on your streetcar and back to the
Wonderful. And what
Thank
an
you.
incredible tour into yesteryear.
Well, I love that
Moral.
building. I love how it kind of rose from the ashes, basically. It was a really fun book to work on, and I met a lot of characters, and I'm just proud of that anchor in San Francisco.
So how long did you work on the book?
About a year and a half, probably half research and half writing.
Tell us about your process for researching the book. What were your research sources?
Well, I usually start, free is good. So Library of Congress, if you can find a treasure trove on Library of Congress, then you're in good shape. And since the building is on the National Register of Historic Places, I found the application for that. I found the photos showing the whole process and that kind of thing. Then, of course, San Francisco Public Library, the 6th floor there, the San Francisco room is indispensable. The Historical Society, the State Library in Sacramento. I try to go to libraries because online research only goes so far, because that means things pretty much have to be digitized already. And the real treasures are the things that nobody's seen before. And so you have to dig. And I really love that part of it. I love even going to Sacramento. Oh, you know who else was really helpful? In Sassoon City, there is, up the Delta there, is a train museum. And they had a ton of Southern Pacific images. And they were so helpful, just all these train buffs. They just kept pulling more and more pictures for me. And the other really good source of photos, which a lot of people don't know about, is our own Muni. Our Muni has an archive and I think 2 full-time archivists. So you get things going back for years, and they're very, very helpful. And they, so they, all the like this shot, the last shot there, the one of the California streetcar, that's all from Muni. And they have an extensive archive that's very well organized.
You mentioned the Library of Congress at the beginning of your description of research sources. Did you look at that from here, from online?
Oh yeah, no, yes. I had,
Okay.
for my other book, I did go to the Library of Congress once because I was in Washington anyway, and it's kind of fun.
Yeah, how fun.
You know, if you're a research geek, that kind of thing is fun. So I got my pass. No, they have many, many things digitized, but sometimes, you know, they don't. But I found pictures for the book from the Depression, especially bridge building, because the WPA photographers, things like that, and it's all digitized. It's a great resource.
St. Francis members may also like to know that our yacht club probably would not have been founded were it not for the ferry service disrupting what had then been the San Francisco Yacht Club's location in Sausalito, where the Trident now is on the Sausalito waterfront. That used to be the third site of the San Francisco Yacht Club, which started in San Francisco and then got kicked out of Long Bridge by the SP, went to 2 locations in downtown San Francisco, members' offices actually, before building a facility on the bridgeway of Sausalito, where it stayed until 1927, when the membership of the San Francisco Yacht Club sort of broke in half of which decided to go to Belvedere, to the beautiful co-facility of San Francisco Yacht Club now, and the other half went off to found the St. Francis Yacht Club on the city front. The major complaint and reason for leaving the Sausalito location was the ferry traffic caused the boats at anchor to rock so much you couldn't have a good cocktail party with another ferry going by. And the ferries kept going back and forth as traffic continued. Had the bridge been built, the ferries wouldn't have been knocking the cocktails about, and we probably still would have 1 yacht club, not 2 St. Francis and San Francisco yacht clubs. No break-off issue.
Great story. I didn't know that. That's great.
When you work with your editor, what's the role of an editor with a thoughtful writer who knows her subject as you? What did your editor do for you?
You know, I think different publishers handle things differently. I turned in, it is my career. I turned in a pretty clean manuscript. So I didn't need a lot of grammatical work, but you kind of sign documents saying that, yes, you got all these permissions and you are clear to use them. They don't double check you on that. So
publishing rights.
Yeah. And I had a whole system for doing that, because the last thing I wanted was for somebody to say, you couldn't use that photo. What are you doing? So basically they read it. They made sure that I had assigned the right caption to the right photo, and just sort of did a review, and then you get proofs and the whole thing. But it wasn't a heavy edit.
What was your schedule? Did you have writing hours?
Well, at the time I was still on the first book, I was still working. So it was kind of maybe 2 or 3 hours a day. And then as I was winding up my consulting business, I usually worked 4 or 5 hours from about 10 to 3 or so. But, you know, there was some travel too, because I'd go to Sassoon City or I'd be in the library, because librarians are a researcher's friend. They love detective hunts. So I became quite, the people at SF Public are my buddies. So yeah, so I would work a number of hours each day. And I would also, I'd say I drew out a whole schedule. I said in September, I need to do, you know, chapter 1, which is 30 photos, an intro, blah, blah, blah. So I mapped it out according to when I had promised to turn in the book.
Did you write with an outline? What was the structure of your writing?
Yeah, I outline. I mean, that's how I was taught. And I kept extensive notes. I used an online note service, and then I would put things in chapters and then flesh out the text. So this book it's heavily, mostly photos and then intros. So the text isn't that heavy. My third book, the one on lost department stores, is the opposite. It's way more text. And that's a lot of writing, but I enjoy it.
So did you use Microsoft Word?
Oh yeah, I use Word. The publisher was very, very strict about how they wanted things delivered. I mean, down to the font size and the margin size and what captions are supposed to be formatted in and what text, because they want to hit a button and have it flow into their templates.
Mm-hmm. And then when you got the book, what you consider to be finished, have you ever been playing with it all the way along?
No,
okay.
No, but you have to have the book accepted, you have to sort of prove you can do it. I think it was a 15-page, almost like an application, who's going to be interested, maybe a sample chapter, a table of contents. They want to make sure you're going to follow through before they put anything towards it.
When you say who's going to be interested, you're talking about the target readership?
Right. Like I know I really researched which societies and associations and clubs need speakers and who would be interested. And you get a pretty good list going in San Francisco of the various groups. So now that I've done 3 books, I've talked about all 3 at many of the associations.
So when San Francisco was an emerging metropolis, and nobody would have thought to use that word then because it was just a boom town of a sort, the Ferry Building was sort of like the establishment. It was the early establishment, and it was interfacing the city with the transportation that kept being used to fill up the city. In those days, the Ferry Building was not thought of as being artsy, but it seemed to be that it was a center of commerce. So the business people and the Ferry Building, all of downtown San Francisco was like, it was an important part of the city structure.
Absolutely. It was very important. It was commerce. It was commerce. It was getting people in and out. The whole port. We are a port city. We needed goods coming in and all that. So managing the port was a very big deal. And it still is a big deal with sea level rise and bond issues and trying to keep things from falling apart.
And so how did the establishment that helped refurbish the Ferry Building feel about that? Those very sort of almost abstract pieces of art that got placed in the Embarcadero, the gigantic arrow sticking down, giant boulder lights.
I don't know. I think that was the Arts Commission, I guess. I think anything to bring people out and make it a vibrant place. I think they were for that. And the Port Commission, I was in their offices. They were another source of photos, the Port Commission themselves, because the city owns the building. The Port Commission is kind of the umbrella organization, and then there's a leasing agent who does all the retail leases. So the Port Commission offices were the staff there were very helpful to me. But they want it to be a vibrant place, so they're open to ideas.
I know this might seem like a silly question, but were there scary moments when you did the book? Tell me something when you got worried or scared or nervous about something.
Well, I was never really scared, but there was one person, and I can't remember his name, but he had some information I wanted. And I was sort of warned about him that he was kind of odd. No one would give me his phone number, but they would give him my phone number. But when he called, I would have to pick it up because he wouldn't leave a message. It was like cloak and daggers. And I forget what it was that this guy, what information he had that I wanted, but it was not my normal way of dealing with, you leave messages, you call back or you text or whatever. But I think I did talk to him once and he was helpful, but I'm so happy that when he called, I picked up. But I think he knew something about some of the history in the building in the 1920s that I was trying to research. There used to be a big not really a bay model. Well, it was a bay model, different than the one in Sausalito, but there was a big display there, and he knew something about that. But anyway, that was the oddest thing. Other than that, you meet a lot of characters, but they're all great.
A mentor of my early career, Walter Landor, had a ferry built called the Klamath, which was on the north edge of the Ferry Building.
Right.
And he used to throw these grand parties weekly. It was amazing.
I've been to one. I've been there. Yeah.
Exactly. He would throw these great parties. And you would look over and see a view of the Ferry Building, of course, and see all the sort of what's going on in the water. Yeah. And then you can look over and also see the city front. But people have now probably don't understand that the Ferry Building went through a period of being a very vibrant center. It went from being like the hub of the city when it was first done, and it was at the base of Market Street. And then it went through sort of disrepair during the Embarcadero Freeway period when it was kind of eclipsed in the shadow. And now it's kind of resuscitated as a beautiful place with nice shishi restaurants and a good farmer's market. And you can buy all kinds of exotic goodies there again. So it's wonderful to see it kind of go this full cycle.
Right.
You know,
and the offices that are there are very high end. I mean, it's investment firms and lawyers, and it's considered a prestige address. Absolutely. And
it's nice to be able to commute. I have many buddies who commute into Belvedere and or from Sausalito, and it's a great way to get to downtown San Francisco.
Yeah.
I had an office in One Market for a while, and you could look down right at the Ferry Building, and it was this incredible, beautiful view. So it's quite a nice little kind of landmark building in San Francisco's history. That's continued.
Absolutely.
So what's your next project? What are you going to work on next?
I'm looking for inspiration. I think, my third book was published early March last year. So that wasn't great timing with the pandemic. I had like 9 or 10 various events scheduled, and I went, oh, well, the whole world just went. But then we discovered Zoom. So I did about 20 Zoom presentations about the new book. So it worked out okay, but I don't like, I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I have to get inspired. I have to think, wow, nobody's done this. And I bet there's some material that I can dig up. So we'll see. We'll see. I'm still sort of promoting the third book a bit, just because of the pandemic. It kind of got drawn out.
So let's remind our viewers that Ann Ivers HItz has actually done 3 books. This Ferry Building book, one of them, but she's also done one on the lost department stores of San Francisco and one on the Great Emporium.
And they're available the usual places. I wish I could say small bookstores, but I never quite know what they're going to have in stock. But Amazon and Arcadia Publishing, the publisher, carry it. So,
Ann Ivers HItz, it was great to have you as a guest of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Thanks so much for adding to the cultural life of San Francisco with your books. We look forward to seeing you down at the Yacht Club whenever you want to come down and learn about our club, because it's got quite a heritage of its own. It's only new since 1927, but it's coming up on the 100th year anniversary. So,
well, I've been there more than once. So it's a wonderful San Francisco institution.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.